February 2026. CISA, the US CISA, just warns that the Poland's power grids, get attacked in December and reveal some of the details. And one of the possible root cause is reused passwords. We have heard a lot of stories about the encryption algorithms TLS1 and 34 still used widely, but passwords. All right, 2026. It's not like 15 years ago. And what are the most common passwords in 2026? The usual suspects, right? They're still the same as they were 20 years ago. And this didn't get noticed by the European authorities, the European Commission specifically. They said, okay, it sounds like from the baby monitors to smartwatches to everything that's around us, and the software, contains some of the risks. And less apparently to many users is the risk such product software may present, like passwords and everything else. And after saying that, they did this. Boom. They just dropped the EU Cyber Resiliency Act on the all modern infrastructure that we all have. Welcome to B-Sides Galway. Welcome to the talk that's going to be about the EU CRA. My name is Roman and I work for Red Hat. I do multiple security things on the internet, but also I joined this nice effort to make sure the EU CRA is useful and meaningful for everybody in the ecosystem, including, of course, the companies, but most importantly, the ecosystem as a whole. So I'm official expert on the European standardization bodies and work together with others on that. So today's talk, of course, will contain some of the education what CRA really means, but the second part will be more practical about what we are going to do about this as developers, as company employers, but also as contributors and maintainers to the open source. And of course, nothing in this presentation is legal advice by any means, because that's all super complicated. Who have heard about the CRA before? Oh, a lot in the room, and who are scared? A little bit. Yeah, me too, quite frankly. So we'll try to figure that out. So what CRA is? It is the regulation among the EU that means directly applicable for EU 27 member states, and it aims to safeguard consumers and businesses buying so-called PDEs. This acronym will be instrumental for the whole presentation. Products with digital elements, and that includes hardware and software, basically everything. Via mandatory cybersecurity requirements, mainly for manufacturers through the whole life cycle of these products, but also its entire supply chain. Including third-party dependencies and etc. And it's applicable worldwide to all the companies that sell or place the products in the European market. That's why it's so huge, it's so instrumental. Now, so who is using open source for work or for something, some of you, but probably others just don't know yet. Because, I love numbers, right? But I do kind of have this statement that open source is everywhere. And of course, all modern digital infrastructure depends on all the open source and all these small projects that's maintained by one person. Basically, there are more than 90% of the projects with one maintainer. But I love numbers also to support these statements. This is the study by Linux Foundation, open source. Forms the backbone of modern software. 90% of commercial open source actually powers all the infrastructure. So that's quite big. On the other hand, we see some of the reports, for example, this one by Black Duck, right? A lot of code bases, like definitely more than 90% contain the open source on the one hand, and on the other hand, 96% of the code bases contained at least one vulnerability. They kind of not updated and etc. And we have heard about this. a little bit during the keynote, right? There are no updates, there are outdated algorithms, and etc., etc. So that's quite big. And that is why open source came to play when it comes to the EU Cyber Resilience Act. Because you may wonder, okay, what about open source? It's all about phones, laptops, and commercial software. But open source is everywhere, as PDEs are, right? Projects with digital elements. And the law CRA, it defines different categories for the PDEs. The first is default category on the left-hand side of this slide. This is basically consumer devices, everything, software and hardware containing software. And that's going to be more than 90% of everything that qualified as a PDEs. But also we have other categories. For example, important class 1, important class 2, and critical. And as you can see on the slides, they are representing the certain types of the products that are kind of really important, right? I probably don't want to, my firewall to be hacked or my smart home appliances to be hacked, right? That's why they fall to the certain categories, and categories are built for the purpose then to kind of distinguish the requirements for each of them, right? For critical, of course, there's going to be more strict requirements, from cybersecurity standpoint. So that's all different categories, but default one is really massive. Again, it's everything. It's all the piece of the software and the hardware. Now, of course, there are some of the exceptions, and it's still not 100% clear how those exceptions will be applicable. I would tell you, nobody really knows how CRL will be applicable in practice because it's so complicated, it's so complex, and we kind of learn as we working on the implementing things around this, but certain things are out of scope. For example, products covered by other regulations, like automotive, medical, aviation, which kind of makes sense. They're two different things. Products designed for national security, pure websites, also out of scope. Software as a service, like clouds and etc., also kind of out of scope, but this is again so complicated because there is the so-called RDPS, Remote Data Processing Solution. Pretend you use the application for a fridge freezer to tune some of the, characteristic temperature and etc. and perhaps order you some food in it. And the only purpose of this application is actually to manage your fridge freezer. In this case, it could be clarified in scope, despite the fact that it's kind of most certainly located in the cloud. So this kind of the things we'll still need to figure out what's in scope, what's out of scope, but that's what we know, at least at the moment. And yay, free and open source software, also out of scope if it's not used in course of commercial activity. Okay. And later in December, I think last year, EU Commission released this beautiful official FAQ about the CRA. You can Google it. You can, there are a lot of clarifications, a lot of answers to the basic questions. So we have been working on it all together among other experts. Now, open source is out of scope, isn't it? But we have these things. And I think this is the libc, and this is an email that libc got. Like, hello, I hope this message finds you well. So far, perfect start. But then what we saw is, okay, would you mind guys to answer libc, right? Would you mind guys in libc to answer these questions? Are you kind of, since you're a vendor probably and we consume libc to our own products or to our own infrastructure within the company, do you implement secure lifecycle or secure secure controls for libc, right? For open source project. And could you please do us a favor and send us proof of conformity? What the heck? Proof of conformity. We kind of big companies don't even know how it will look like. I mean, we're working on it, of course, but it's not yet clear, right? And also they said, okay, this is the due date, right? And in 2 weeks, probably, give us this information. Unfortunately, this is happening with a lot of open source projects out there, and that creates anxiety, that creates uncertainty, and that creates anger and everything. And that's why we are talking about this. That's why we are trying to clarify some things and make sure the kind of open source feels good about all these things, despite the fact that naturally regulations are not that friendly, right? Generally for developers, but for open source system or ecosystem specifically. Now, it's very important to clarify important roles in the Cyber Resilience Act. And first of all, the manufacturer, the key player under the regulation. You can think of it as a vendor, right? The company that produces the products. So that is more or less clear. There are also importers and distributors that are bringing the product into the market, like partners, resellers, and etc. If the manufacturer is outside the EU, but there is the entity that resells here, that's an importer and distributor. Also, we have all of these developers, engineers, contributors, and maintainers of open source. And as I said already, they're out of scope if they don't monetize the project. And there is a brand new role under the regulation. We have never seen something like this before, that called Open Source Software Steward, and we will be using simply Steward. That entity meant to support free and open source software projects, not products. For example, think of foundation like Linux Foundation, Eclipse, or big companies that are behind open source projects, but they don't sell them necessarily. Like Linux kernel or Kubernetes, for example, right? They're pure open source, and they're governed by Linux Foundation in this particular case. Most of the open source projects, however, will not have stewards. Right? As I mentioned, the vast majority, overwhelming vast majority of open source projects are maintained by one person, and they're not going to be governed by any foundation or something like this. This is important to keep in mind. Now, how it's going to work? Because probably you're confused, right? Like all the terms. How it's intended to be working, what's in the spirit in the CRA. By the way, if you're wondering, this is a cheese picture, the famous one that's coined by a EU Commission, like representing what CRA is for. Like finally closing all of these holes in the supply chain and all of these vulnerabilities and everything else, right? So that's like, why cheese picture comes to play. Now, how it all works? We have manufacturer, right, in the center here, and it sells PDEs, product visual elements, to customers. Now let's pretend there is the vulnerability founded, and it's in the third party, right? It's in the open source project, like happening every day, frankly, right? But there are, yes, and hopefully the manufacturer is generous enough to report this back somehow if the community or open source project is not already handling this stuff, but somehow to communicate back, hey guys, this is the probably vulnerability in the project, and this is the PR. I'm a generous manufacturer. I'm gonna help you fix things. Ideal world, right? But there are a lot of projects, right? Of course, we are not dependent on only one project. We're dependent on thousands of them. So there are a lot of them. And that's how stewards can come to play, especially for these big projects and these ecosystems like cloud native ecosystem or Java ecosystem or something else, right? And they are going to be the one window so that manufacturer hopefully can work with the stewards and can support somehow. It could be money, it could be just the time to produce some fixes, but some kind of support. And then we're going to have the secure products, right? Everything is fixed on the very left. Shift and left, right? Rings the bell. So, like brand new. Everything will be fixed in the very left and everybody will be happy, especially consumers, because that is what the UK mission is here for, right? To produce the law that ultimately protects the customers or consumers or people or companies. But the big questions are still around, why as a manufacturer should pay and what for, and, why as a open source maintainer of all these projects, I need to necessarily fix something or improve my security posture. What for? That's the complication. But the idea, for the ideal world is on the screen. Yes. That's the problem, right? I mean, this is good, of course. And we wanted to preserve this as we work across the ecosystem, right? But on the other hand, wanted to make it right. Now, this is the simplified workflow or something, as I got tons of questions every day from people who are supporting, by the way, who is contributing to open source somehow at least. Great. I love you guys. And I have enormous amount of question. Okay, how we are affected if we are contributing to open source, or even if we maintain the open source project, or if we work for a company and we maintain the project, but it's like an open source. Should we shoot it down because, the CRA now comes to play and my company, could be a manufacturer and, something like this. But this is simplified diagram how to cope with this. If you're contributing to the project that you're not maintainer, just contributing somehow, you don't have any obligations out of scope. So go down. If you're a maintainer and don't take money for anything, like you're a hobbyist, you are out of scope, like whatsoever, regardless of anything else. If you're a maintainer and accept donations that cover reasonable costs, which is kind of the weird explanation, but still it is in the law, you also don't have any obligations. Again, the question would be how it's reasonable cost, blah, blah, blah. But if you just take donations and do the normal development, don't be scared, don't care, you're out of scope 100%. Now, only if you're a maintainer and charge for some additional services for the open source project, like support or SLAs or kind of services or data or you sell the project itself somehow packed in something else. In this case, you might have obligations under the CRA, but if you don't do anything regarding the monetization, you're out of scope. This is very important to understand because, it's still a confusion. Just to reiterate, if you're a contributor or software developer, you're out of scope whatsoever. If you're a maintainer, you're out of scope if you don't monetize. If any of these roles, you're out of scope if your project not a PDE. It is also a good example. A lot of projects just, scripts or documentation on the site. That's not a product with digital elements by definition, right? And any of those roles, you're out of scope if the PDE is not placed on the market, which is kind of legal term, but still very important to understand that you're out of scope. And almost all the requirements are for manufacturers. Right, so you don't, again, as a maintainer, you don't have any obligations under the CRA, because if you monetize your project, you're a manufacturer, right? So unfortunately, but all requirements for manufacturers, there are some for stewards, so I'll be talking about this briefly, but it's, again, very important to stress out. Now, requirements for manufacturers. This is not the talk for manufacturers. I have another 3 hours to educate manufacturers on the CRA journey, but just one slide at quick glance. For manufacturers, for those companies who actually produce the products, they need to do security by design and by default, risk management, and all of these things. I'm not going to read all of them. Due diligence for third parties is a very important thing because it's connected directly to the dependencies and to the open source. Right? Due diligence, kind of, again, weird term, but that means making sure that security posture of all your dependencies is good in the nutshell. Again, we'll break it down a little bit later. There are if you read all of these requirements so far, there are quite natural, I think, at least for each company should have been doing this already, right? It's like, basic security principles. And of course, as an all security nerd, I kind of support these things. There are some new things, conformity assessment and CE marking, which is not clear how to do for software. If you kind of get a phone or printer or laptop produced in the EU, you can find this sticker, CE mark. So that's the idea that puts CE marks on the products, but how to affix this to the piece of software still unclear now, but it's going to be something. And also updates. There are mandatory free updates for 5 years for the products and 10 years for retention of documentations, free of charge. Now, you might ask the question, this is all good, but what exactly I should be doing as a manufacturer, just in case we have manufacturers in the room, or those companies that produce PDs. There are going to be 41 standards that support CRA and those lovely organizations, SENS, MELEC, and ETSI, European Standardization Organizations, developing these standards at the moment. And the important thing, it's still possible to contribute. They're still in draft mode, and we're still accepting the contributions. If you wanted to contribute, if you generous enough to work on the standardization, let me know. We need more people from the industry experts actually to shape this in the right way. Now for the timelines, the most popular question that I get about the timelines. So, when the deadline, when the day, when, I'm going to be affected, right? Formally, CRA is already in force as of December 2024, but the two most important obligations will be fully enforced first reporting obligations for vulnerabilities. The huge part of the CRA is around reporting vulnerabilities to ENISA, which is cybersecurity agency in Europe, and local CSORTs, for example, National Cybersecurity Center here in Ireland. And in December 2027, everything else will enter in force. That's not that much time left, actually. Already this year, the reporting thing is going to be enforced, and by the end of next year, everything that's put on the market should have CE marks, along with other requirements implemented. And fines, of course, it's not going to be working like GDPR and all these things, right? If we wouldn't have fines. So up to 2.5% of the worldwide turnover and, 15 million euros, etc. So that's quite scary. But again, this is all for manufacturers, right? Everybody else, including the stewards, they're not affected by these fines. Requirements for stewards. I mentioned those lovely organizations like foundations and also big companies that are going to be also stewards for some projects. There are light touch regime, so-called light touch regulatory regime for stewards. That's not going to be fines, but those stewards, they should be doing some things like posting the cybersecurity policy, again, reporting vulnerabilities for actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents for the underlying infrastructure of the projects that they support, and also make sure that secure development practices are implemented. But again, this is like no hard requirements so far, and we also try to figure out what does it mean for stewards to be compliant, quote unquote, with the CRA, and also they need to cooperate with market surveillance authorities and CSORTs and ENISA across Europe. So nothing really tremendous for stewards. So they have some obligations, but not that much. Again, everything is designed to be for manufacturers. Now, requirements for FOSS maintainers. Do we have any requirements? No. As I said, no requirements for maintainers. Even though if the stewards kind of will be covering for maintainers somehow, there are no requirements for maintainers themselves whatsoever. And this is very important to understand. Now, as I mentioned, there are still some, ambiguity, uncertainty, and anxiety around it. And if you're a maintainer or contributor to open source project, it's very important to understand how to react to those kind of requests. Let's put it politely, by the big companies. For example, they can ask, okay, are you CRA compliant? As I mentioned in my example for libc, as part of our CRA audit, here's what I need from you, right? You feel the sense, right? The company is doing their CRA audit, but asking open source projects to do something about it. Or, for example, some of the foundations or stewards or even companies can offer open source projects to be your steward. Because, again, it could be different There could be different reasons behind this. That could be very kind of generous and clear reasons, but also they could be like, okay, I want to have more and more open source projects under my purview because of some reasons, because the foundations, they, still raise some money and etc., etc. So consider it as an opportunity, right? Express rather how to help your project. So I would suggest to turn these conversations into the help. I mean, if you want to. If you don't want to, you just can politely decline in the way of I'm not your supplier. And I'm going to be sharing slides, of course, openly, but we are working on the clarifications, and there are FAQ already available, free and open out there, how exactly you want to communicate to your downstream users about this CRA, right? With all of the links to the regulations and etc. So you just want to copy and paste it to README file, and that's it, and say, hey, go away. Yes, but consider it as an opportunity, and if you don't, and you don't have to have a steward, of course, if you have the open source project. But you can also point out to other stewards who can monetize your projects. We have a lot of examples with a project like curl, for example, or OpenSSL, which are free open source projects, but there are different entities that are commercial entities that offer support for these projects for money. So it makes sense to kind of reroute to these organizations as well. So that is kind of type of the reaction, I believe, that would save your kind of nerves and everything, rather than just be angry and etc. Now, we still have a lot of questions that not necessarily all of them have answers, but what does CRA mean for me anyway, right? I have been talking about this like approximately 30 minutes, but you may ask, okay, that's all, a lot of stuff and it's all complicated, it's all the rules. What does it mean? What exactly to do for free and open source projects to be CRA compatible or something? Do you need to, how to document this? What if I want to, right? What if the crazy open source projects, not crazy, spoiler, that wants to show that I kind of follow the CRA spirit and all of these good security practices. How are you going to do, I'm going to do about this, right? Who is responsible for actual fixes? Is it still manufacturer? I mean, by CRA, it is kind of expected that the manufacturer should report at least vulnerabilities upstream and fix them, but it's not that clear stated. And you're not alone with all of these questions. I also ask these questions, and the whole community, everybody asks these questions. That's why, we decided that, great, let's come together and work on all of these things together to make sure we have all of the perspective from different players in the industry, from different ecosystems, from different open source projects. And also pull into the discussion policymakers, standards makers, and companies, and etc. So, how we exactly did this and how you can join this effort. First of all, why we as a Red Hat cares, right? It might sound, obvious, but I still want to stress it out because I get these questions all the time, like, why do you guys, the commercial company, how do you care, and why you do all of these things? Because all what we do in the open source, right, it's like true, and we do everything with community. All these projects we do with community, and we just don't want this community to kind of be broken, okay, and to follow unnecessary or weird or unreasonable requirements or something, right? So that's why we do care. Why we care specifically? Because we, Red Hat, as of course a manufacturer, because we sell software for money and we sell it in the European market, and we're a manufacturer for things like RHEL operating system or OpenShift or Red Hat AI and a number of other products. Now we are a steward. Think of the projects like Fedora, Ansible, or Conflux or others. We kind of support these projects. They're pure open source projects. They are free, they are open source, they have communities around them. Of course, Red Hat, not only the one company supports all the projects that I'm talking about, but we provide substantial support, and our goal and our commitment is to continue to do so. That's why we qualified as a steward, right? To help those projects moving on. And we, as a company, will have the certain obligations as a steward for these particular projects. Of course, we are contributors and maintainers. When I asked you the question, who contributes, I also raised my hand. 1,000 of Red Hatters contribute to open source every day. And that's why we joined and actually leading the CRA efforts in open source communities in general, but also with the EU official standardization bodies, as I mentioned, to make sure that open source ecosystem is healthy. Basically, that's the goal. Again, to educate both parties, but most importantly, those policymakers and those guys, how open source works and how the technology works. As we work on the standards, for example, horizontal standards for vulnerability management, the early stages, they was like really, really tough because they don't necessarily know how modern technology works. They don't know how, what's the best practices for SBOMs or for CVD, coordinated vulnerability disclosures. That's why it's super important for us as an experts to jump into this and make sure it is included into the standards. So one of the efforts I wanted to share with you is ORC. That stands for Open Regulatory Compliance, and that's why this little ORC over there. So this is the open community governed by Eclipse Foundation, free to everybody to join. What we do? FAQ, white papers, resources, standards, and clarifying the standards and frameworks. And we're doing specifications and etc., etc. Basically helping everybody to navigate the CRA. It is both for community, but also for manufacturers, because, manufacturers need to know how to interact with open source as they do due diligence and other requirements, right? So we try to work, to make sure we produce something meaningful for all the parties along the community. One of the example of the work that we do is FAQ, and that's got launched, later last year, like a website. What I like about this is, it is, it's beautiful, but also we try to vet all of these questions, and it's about everything, like, combined by topics, and the questions like, I'm worried about how the CRA might impact me, right? I'm considering to shutting down my projects. Should I do this? No, of course not. And this is why, right? This is legal explanation. And for everything else, like, as a manufacturer, what I'm going to do for NIS2 now, for example, right? Directive, and intersection with the CRA. So that's all of the types of the questions. And our goal is to vet these questions across the experts and possibly with the commission as well. So some of the questions have the verified check mark. That means we actually verified these questions. So very good initiative. Now we have Global Cyber Policy Working Group under Linux Foundation and OpenSSF. We do a lot of things over there, also checklists and etc. But I want to stress out one important thing on this slide. We have done free CRA class, which now have like more than 5,000 enrollment. This is free, like zero. Cost of money, and it can, as you take it, it even gives you the, nice Credly badge that you can put on the LinkedIn profile. So just take this class, share this with everybody, just to learn basics about the CRA and how it affects the ecosystem. But also join our efforts, right? All of these communities that I mentioned today, they're free to join to everybody. We don't have any like registrations, whatever. You just can join the calls. You can follow the Slack. You can do whatever and ask your questions. We do really need your questions to make sure we're helpful. What we have done, just recently, this is FOSDEM. Who were at FOSDEM? In Brussels, nobody in this room. So this is the biggest open source gathering in the world, happening annually for 25 years now, I think, in late January. And we have all of this big room, very much the academic, the same stuff. And we did this CRA in practice, with policymakers and everybody else actually attending and listening and contributing, which is absolutely amazing and unprecedented, right? To have all of them along us. What we're going to do, and we're doing right now is Security Slam, which is the challenge pretty much along the lines of the CTF, but the opposite. Idea is to harden open source projects, the security posture. You can join this challenge, securityslam.com, and CRA improvement included into this challenge. If you want to join and earn some badges and etc., just go ahead. Nice activity to be part of. Now, moving a little bit to the practical things. What exactly we do from the practical standpoint? There is so-called OSPS, or security baseline under OpenStaff. It's basically not really 100% security, because there are all the good practices, the framework around the good practices, like access control, documentation, legal, quality, like not only security. The idea is to have the 3 levels of maturity and give you an understanding how you're going to implement those to your project. And the fun thing is, it's designed for open source first and foremost, but it can be applicable inside the companies as well. And we at Red Hat actually do exactly this thing. We adjust our standards to this thing as well. A simple example, one of the requirements, I just picked a random one. The project must prevent the unintentional storage of unencrypted sensitive data such as secrets. Like, you know, guys, I mean, there are still secrets in plain text in repos, right? So those kind of good things. Now, how it's going to help with the CRA, actually, that's all mapped. If you go to the baseline website, there is a mapping to different standards worldwide, like NIST and etc., but also to the CRA itself. And I just brought some examples here. All compiled release software assets must be delivered with the SBOMs, right? One of the requirements for the second level. And SBOMs is direct requirements in the CRA. So that's kind of mapping. Why it's important? Because if you implement these particular checks or some of them, it could then help your project to be CRA ready. If it's open source projects, that also would help downstream users, basically your users of your projects, or manufacturers with their due diligence requirements, which is kind of connection between project, open source, and manufacturers, right? I told about this. Security inside spec is the way how you can demonstrate things, how you can demonstrate that you are CRA ready. Okay. Like it's not only, say you implemented all of these good security practices, but then how as a manufacturer I'm going to figure out that you have actually done that. Of course, that could be like the declaration in the text form in the readme.md, for example, but it could be also in machine readable format in the YAML spec. And we have this security inside spec, which actually expresses your security posture in the machine-readable format. The similar activity is also run by OWASP, together with ECMA standardization body, how to express in machine-readable format these kind of things. Why it's important? Because it's going to be declaration of CRA readiness, helpful and discoverable for your downstream users. Again, you don't have to do anything if you do open source, but those practices can be ingested into your company's inside, okay? Could be useful. Requirements for maintainers? No requirements for maintainers, and that's very important to understand. We don't have them. But as a maintainer, you may want to follow good security practices and quality practices and demonstrate it to the users. How you're going to do this? This is the whole list with a link. I will leave it after. Just super quick, enable security features on your Git platforms like 2FA, branch protections, all of the secret scanning, and etc., etc. But also consider to do other things, like I mentioned. Adherence to open source baseline is good. Check your security MD file. Is it accurate? Is it represents your process and have the necessary context for reporting? And there's a bunch of open source projects. It's all free and open source. I mean, so this is a bunch of recommendations for automation. How to do SBOMs, how to automate those practices in your repo, right? Say you wanted to implement all of these things, but do you want to do it manually? No, Minder can help you, for example. these kind of things. So consider it to do either for your open source projects, or you can take these ideas internally for the company. Conclusions. Why CRA is good? Because CRA has a potential to make more for supply chain security and open source ecosystem as a whole just in a few years. It's a big buzz now, right? Because me personally and all of the security experts, like lurking among the engineers, educating them, saying, hey guys, would you mind to do security better in your development, right? But now we have law, right? Which is generally good. How to make CRA even better? Work with us, join the community, and, regardless of your role as a steward, manufacturer, maintainer, or just the security experts who want to join, we invite you to do so. If you want to read our blog at Red Hat, how we see these things, how we see this huge industry movement, you can check it out. Real takeaways of the talk. First of all, if you are kind of visual guy or want to listen, we did blogs, but also we were guests on the Application Security Weekly podcast with Mike Shema, with this guy in this cylinder hat. They're quite popular podcast. You can watch it on YouTube. You can listen it in the Spotify or whatever. How to approach CRA, what we think, and all of these things. So do not stop to contribute. Learn and educate others. It's free. All that I show, it's really free. Take it as a call for improving quality and security posture, right? Not like, regulation, compliance. Take it as a call for improvement. Act now, because a lot of things are available now. Even though we have some uncertainty, a lot of things are available now. And join community efforts. As I mentioned, we need your voice. We need your questions. We need your problems. If you want to contribute, that's great. But if you just have any questions, join the communities by the QR codes that I mentioned. Be present, and again, just ask questions. Hey, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what to do with that. It could help us to make it right. And let's build a secure future for all in open source way.